There's a quiet moment most people never talk about. The moment when you close the door behind you, and the outside world finally stops asking things from you. No messages to answer. No expectations to meet. No version of yourself to perform. Just silence. And if, in that silence, something inside you relaxes instead of feeling lonely, this video is for you. Because liking to be alone is often misunderstood. It's labeled as withdrawal, or sadness, or a sign that something is missing. But what if the opposite is true? What if enjoying your own company isn't a flaw, but a reflection of how your mind and nervous system are actually wired? Many people assume that those who like being alone are disconnected from life, that they're avoiding relationships, that they're afraid of closeness. But psychology tells a very different story. For some people, solitude isn't emptiness. It's relief. It's the moment their mind stops bracing itself. The moment their body finally feels safe enough to rest. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why people who genuinely like to be alone often share a specific set of personality traits that are deeply misunderstood, often judged, and quietly powerful. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to Emotional Growth. This channel is a space for women who are done forcing themselves into versions of life that don't feel natural anymore. And stay with me, because one of the traits we'll talk about later is often mistaken for emotional distance, when in reality, it's a sign of deep emotional intelligence. Let me ask you something. Have you ever turned down an invitation? Not because you were tired, not because you were upset, not because you didn't like the people involved, but simply because being alone felt like the healthier choice? Have you ever noticed that staying home didn't feel like missing out? It felt like relief. If so, you're not alone. But chances are, at some point in your life, you were made to feel like that preference needed an explanation. Like wanting solitude meant something was wrong. From a very young age, most of us are taught that connection looks a certain way, that a full life is a busy one, that being social means being available, responsive, and constantly engaged. So when someone chooses quiet instead of noise, or space instead of stimulation, it's often misinterpreted. People assume it means loneliness, or avoidance, or emotional distance. But here's what's rarely talked about. Some people don't relax in busy environments. Their bodies don't settle. Their minds don't slow down. Instead, they stay alert, on guard, constantly adjusting. And when they finally step away from all of that, when the noise fades and the expectations drop, their system responds with calm. That response isn't accidental. For certain people, too much stimulation doesn't energize the mind. It overwhelms it, and solitude becomes the place where everything recalibrates. This isn't about disliking people. It's about how your internal system processes the world. Some nervous systems restore themselves through interaction. Others restore themselves through stillness. And when someone with the second type tries to live like the first, they don't become more fulfilled. They become exhausted. So if you've ever felt more like yourself when you're alone, more clear, more balanced, more emotionally steady, that's not a failure to connect. It's a sign that your system knows what it needs. And once you understand that, the traits we're about to explore start to make a lot more sense. Because the first one explains why your mind works the way it does, and why time alone isn't a luxury for you. It's a necessity. Trait number 1, deep internal processing. People who like being alone tend to process life deeply. Not quickly, not on the surface, but beneath it. They don't just move from one experience to the next and leave it behind. They carry experiences with them for a while. They replay conversations in their mind. They reflect on what was said and what wasn't. They notice emotional shifts, subtle reactions, and unspoken tension. This isn't because they're stuck in the past. It's because their mind is designed to understand before it lets go. For them, thinking isn't background noise. It's an active, ongoing process. And when there's too much external input, too many conversations, too many impressions, too many demands, their mind doesn't get the space it needs to organize what it's taking in. That's when mental fatigue sets in. Let me ask you something. Have you ever needed quiet after something emotional, even when it was positive? Have you ever left a long conversation feeling mentally full, not drained by the people, but by the sheer amount of information and emotion you had to process? That doesn't mean you're fragile. It means your mind works in layers. People like this don't skim through life. They dive into it. They don't just hear words, they hear tone. They don't just see actions, they sense intention. They don't just register events, they interpret meaning. This depth often shows up early in life. As children, they might have needed time alone after school. As teenagers, they may have felt overwhelmed by constant social interaction. As adults, they often realize that solitude isn't avoidance, it's recovery. But this trait is frequently misunderstood. From the outside, deep internal processing can look like overthinking, or withdrawal, or being too much in your head. People might say things like, "You think too much. Just let it go. You're making it deeper than it needs to be." But internally, this depth is how clarity forms. Without time alone, thoughts remain unfinished. Emotions remain unresolved. Experiences remain unintegrated. And that unfinished processing creates tension. So solitude becomes the place where the mind finally settles, where thoughts line up instead of colliding, where emotions make sense instead of stacking on top of each other, where understanding replaces confusion. And here's something important to understand. This depth isn't random. It influences how these individuals relate to boundaries, how they manage emotional energy, how they choose relationships, how they respond to stress. Because when you process life deeply, you become very aware of how different environments affect you. You start to notice which situations bring clarity and which ones create noise. And that awareness leads directly to the next trait. Because once you recognize what overwhelms your mind, you naturally become more attentive to how your energy rises and falls. And protecting that energy becomes essential. Trait number 2. Strong awareness of emotional and mental energy. People who enjoy being alone tend to have a strong awareness of their own energy, not in a vague or abstract way, but in a very concrete, bodily one. They notice when their mind starts to feel crowded, when their patience becomes thinner, when their body tightens without an obvious reason. They sense these shifts early, before burnout, before emotional overload, before they reach the point of snapping or shutting down. Instead of ignoring those signals, they've learned to listen to them. Often, this awareness didn't come naturally at first. It was learned over time, sometimes through exhaustion. Many people who value solitude spent years pushing past their limits, staying longer than they wanted to, saying yes when their body wanted to say no, trying to keep up with rhythms that didn't suit them. Eventually, they noticed a pattern. The more they ignored their internal signals, the more drained they felt afterward, so they began to pay attention. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stayed in a social situation longer than you wanted to, and felt completely depleted afterward? Not just tired, but mentally scattered, emotionally flat, or unusually irritable? Have you ever needed hours, or even a full day alone, just to feel like yourself again? That response isn't weakness. It's awareness. Some people recharge by being around others. Conversation energizes them. Stimulation wakes them up. Others recharge by stepping away from stimulation. Quiet restores them. Stillness settles them. Space helps them breathe again. And when someone with the second pattern ignores that need, something predictable happens. They don't suddenly become more social. They become overwhelmed, more reactive, less patient, more emotionally numb. People who enjoy solitude learn to protect their energy because they understand how costly it is to lose it. They don't wait until they're completely drained. They notice the early signs and respond. This changes how they move through the world. They understand that not every invitation deserves a yes. Not every conversation needs to be continued. Not every interaction is worth the internal price it requires. This isn't avoidance. It's discernment, and it often gets misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal, or low tolerance, or being too sensitive. But internally, it's about sustainability. They're not trying to avoid people. They're trying to preserve their capacity to show up in a way that feels genuine and steady. And once someone understands how their energy works, something else begins to shift. They stop looking outside themselves for constant reassurance. They stop needing external feedback to feel okay. Because when you know how to regulate your energy, you don't need others to stabilize you. And that leads directly to the next trait. Because emotional steadiness that comes from within changes how validation is experienced and how much of it is actually needed. Trait number 3, low dependence on external validation. People who like being alone tend to rely less on external validation. They don't constantly look to others to confirm how they're doing or who they should be. That doesn't mean they don't care about people. And it doesn't mean relationships aren't important to them. It means their sense of stability doesn't rise and fall based on how others respond. They're able to sit with their own thoughts, with their own reactions, with their own emotional states. And over time, that ability builds something powerful. It builds trust in themselves. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable some people become when there's nothing to distract them? No phone, no conversation, no background noise. They reach for something, anything, to fill the silence. People who enjoy being alone don't feel that same urgency. Silence doesn't feel threatening to them. It doesn't feel like a void that needs to be filled. It feels neutral, sometimes even grounding, because they've learned how to regulate themselves internally, instead of relying on constant reassurance from others. This often develops slowly. Many of these individuals spent years being very aware of how others reacted to them. They noticed shifts in tone, changes in mood, subtle disapproval or approval. At some point, constantly adjusting became exhausting. So they stopped outsourcing their sense of worth. They learned to ask themselves, how do I feel about this? Does this align with me? Is this actually right for me? Instead of waiting for external confirmation. From the outside, this can be misunderstood. People might assume they're emotionally distant, or detached, or uninterested. Sometimes they're told they're too independent, or that they don't seem to need anyone. But what's actually happening is different. Their emotional balance isn't being constantly recalibrated by other people's opinions, moods, or reactions. They don't need frequent reassurance to feel okay. That doesn't make them cold. It makes them steady. And that steadiness changes how relationships are chosen. When you don't need validation to feel whole, you're no longer drawn to connection out of insecurity. You're drawn to it out of authenticity. You don't connect to be seen. You connect to be understood. And that difference matters, because it leads directly to the next trait. When validation isn't the goal, connection becomes more intentional. And that's why people who enjoy solitude tend to be very selective about who they let close. Trait number 4, selective and intentional relationships. People who like being alone are rarely uninterested in relationships. They're uninterested in unfiltered access. They don't want constant interaction just for the sake of interaction. They don't feel fulfilled by being surrounded by people if the connection lacks depth. Instead of spreading themselves thin across many relationships, they invest deeply in a few. This is why their social circle often looks smaller from the outside, but feels much richer on the inside. They don't build relationships out of habit, or obligation, or fear of being alone. They build them out of intention. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt more connected after one honest, meaningful conversation than after spending hours in a group setting? Have you ever noticed that too many interactions, even pleasant ones, leave you feeling scattered or emotionally tired? For people who enjoy solitude, connection has a cost. Not because people are bad, not because they dislike others, but because social interaction requires attention, emotional presence, and adjustment. It requires reading cues, responding thoughtfully, managing energy, and when those costs aren't respected, exhaustion follows. So they become selective. They choose people who feel safe, people who don't demand constant availability, people who don't interpret space as rejection. This selectivity is often misunderstood. Others may assume they're distant, or guarded, or uninterested in closeness, but in reality, they're protecting depth. They know that meaningful connection requires energy, and energy is finite, so instead of giving a little to everyone, they give a lot to the few who truly matter. This creates relationships that are calmer, more honest, more sustainable over time. There's less performance, less pressure, less emotional negotiation. And there's another important aspect to this. People who enjoy being alone often become very aware of the difference between being connected and being constantly accessible. They understand that availability doesn't equal intimacy. You can respond to every message and still feel unseen. You can attend every gathering and still feel emotionally alone. So they stop equating presence with closeness. They focus on relationships where space is allowed, where silence isn't awkward, where independence isn't interpreted as withdrawal. And when someone doesn't cling, chase, or constantly check in, it's easy for others to misread that as indifference. But the truth is very different. For people who value solitude, Connection is strongest when it's chosen freely, not maintained out of obligation or fear. And this way of relating naturally leads to another trait. Because when someone is comfortable standing on their own emotionally, they don't attach out of need. They attach out of choice. And that brings us to the next trait, one that is often misunderstood, especially in emotionally intense relationships. Trait number 5, emotional independence, often misunderstood. People who like being alone tend to be emotionally independent. This is one of the traits that gets misunderstood the most, especially in a world that often confuses emotional closeness with constant presence. Emotional independence doesn't mean emotional distance. It doesn't mean shutting people out, and it doesn't mean not needing anyone. It means they don't rely on other people to regulate their emotions for them. They can sit with discomfort without immediately needing distraction. They can process feelings without rushing to be reassured. They don't panic when things go quiet. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been told you're too independent? Have people ever assumed you don't need support simply because you don't constantly ask for it? That assumption is common and often deeply inaccurate. People who enjoy being alone have usually learned, over time, how to stabilize themselves internally. They've learned how to pause before reacting, how to let emotions rise and fall without acting on every impulse, how to calm themselves without external intervention. Often, this skill wasn't taught. It was developed. Many of these individuals spent years being the one who handled things, the one who stayed composed, the one who didn't fall apart when others did. And at some point, they realized something important. Needing less doesn't mean feeling less. It simply means their emotional center is inside them, not dependent on constant reassurance or intensity from others. This creates a very specific dynamic in relationships. They show up because they want to, not because they're afraid to be alone. They stay because the connection adds something meaningful, not because they fear losing it. To people who are used to emotional dependence, this can feel unfamiliar, sometimes even threatening, because emotional independence challenges the idea that closeness must always be urgent, intense, or consuming. But for someone who values solitude, emotional independence is what makes connection honest. They're not there to fill a void. They're not looking for someone to complete them. They're there because the relationship fits, not because they need it to survive emotionally. This doesn't make their love shallow. It often makes it more stable, more grounded, more consistent over time. And this trait tends to become stronger with age. As women move through life, many realize that emotional chaos isn't passion, that intensity doesn't equal intimacy, that peace is not boredom. And once someone reaches that understanding, another shift begins to happen. Because when emotional balance is internal, the constant search for stimulation loses its appeal. And that leads directly to the next trait. Trait number 6, a strong need for meaning, not stimulation. People who like being alone are rarely bored. What they struggle with isn't a lack of activity, it's a lack of meaning. They're not interested in filling time just to avoid silence. They're interested in spending time in ways that actually feel nourishing. This is why constant stimulation can feel draining to them. Endless small talk that goes nowhere. Plans made simply to stay busy. Noise that doesn't add anything, emotionally or mentally. None of that feels satisfying. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been busy all day, moving from one task to the next, and still felt oddly empty by the end of it? And on the other hand, have you ever spent a quiet afternoon alone, reading, reflecting, creating, or simply resting, and felt more fulfilled than after an entire weekend of plans? That contrast matters. People who enjoy solitude tend to have a very clear internal signal for what feels meaningful to them. They're drawn to experiences that allow depth. They want to engage fully with what they're doing, not just pastime. This is why their interests often look quiet from the outside, but feel rich on the inside. Learning something new, thinking deeply about past experiences, creating, writing, planning, or exploring ideas, spending time in nature, sitting with their own thoughts without rushing to escape them. These moments aren't empty. They're full of insight, full of emotional processing, full of clarity. And because meaning matters more to them than stimulation, they naturally begin to question cultural messages that say a full life has to look busy, loud, or constantly social. They stop chasing experiences just because they're popular. They stop saying yes just to feel included. They stop measuring their lives by how much they're doing. Instead, they start asking different questions. Does this add something real to my life? Does this leave me feeling grounded or scattered? Does this support who I'm becoming, or pull me away from myself? This shift doesn't make them less engaged with life. It makes them more intentional about where they place their attention. And over time, this focus on meaning begins to reshape how they live. They simplify their schedules. They protect their time. They leave space between commitments, not because they lack ambition, but because they understand that clarity needs room to breathe. And when someone values meaning this strongly, another trait quietly takes shape. Because once you stop performing life for others, once you stop chasing stimulation that doesn't nourish you, you begin to organize your life around what truly fits you. And that leads us to the final trait, the one that ties everything together. Trait number 7, choosing alignment over performance. People who like being alone tend to choose alignment over performance. They're less interested in how life looks from the outside, and more concerned with how it feels on the inside. They stop asking themselves, what should I want? And start asking, what actually works for me? This shift doesn't happen overnight. For many people, it comes after years of trying to keep up. Years of saying yes when their body wanted to say no. Years of forcing themselves into social rhythms that never quite fit. Eventually, something becomes clear. Living out of alignment comes at a cost. It shows up as exhaustion, as irritability, as a constant sense of being slightly overwhelmed. So they begin to structure their lives differently. They protect their time. They simplify their schedules. They create space between commitments. Not because they're giving up on life, but because they're finally listening to it. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how much calmer you feel when your days aren't packed with obligations? Have you ever realized that you function better when your life has more space in it? That's alignment, and it's often mistaken for withdrawal. From the outside, a quiet life can look small, but from the inside, it can feel spacious. People who enjoy being alone aren't trying to disappear. They're trying to live in a way that doesn't constantly fight their own nature. And once they stop performing for expectations that were never designed for them, something changes. Their energy stabilizes. Their emotions settle. Their sense of self becomes clearer. They're no longer torn between who they are and who they think they're supposed to be. This doesn't mean they never challenge themselves. It means they choose challenges that lead to growth, not ones that lead to depletion. There's a common belief that growth only happens when you push yourself beyond your comfort zone. But for people who value solitude, growth often looks different. It looks like trusting their internal signals. It looks like honoring their limits. It looks like building a life that supports their nervous system, instead of constantly overwhelming it. And when that happens, something important becomes possible. Presence. You can be physically present at countless events, and emotionally absent from all of them. Or you can be alone, fully present, engaged with your thoughts, your feelings, your inner world. For some people, that's where meaning lives. And here's the truth that rarely gets said out loud. People who like being alone are not avoiding life. They're engaging with it on their own terms. They're not broken. They're not antisocial. They're not missing out. They're aligned. And alignment changes everything. If this video resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to Emotional Growth. This channel is a space for women who are learning to stop forcing themselves into lives that don't feel natural anymore, and start building ones that do. And I'd love to hear from you. Which of these traits felt most familiar? Was it the need for quiet, the depth of your inner world, the way you protect your energy? Leave a comment and share your experience. You're not alone in this, even if you enjoy being by yourself. Thank you for being here.